Hello everybody and welcome to this video. Welcome back to the channel if you are a recurring user, so to speak, and welcome to the channel to all those that join me for the first time. We will discuss the collective unconscious from another perspective in this video today, and the perspective that we'll take is more philosophical. So we will think about dreams and the implications of the sort of dual aspect monist perspective that we've been discussing in some videos, and think about dreams, therefore, in this dual aspect perspective as an access point to sort of a, let's say, a timeless space. So this video will be sort of led by a quote that Jung once uttered. I don't know it entirely, by the letter, but the quote is something along the lines of, if you pay attention to your dreams, and he says this in an interview, and you'll find this on YouTube. There are not many interviews that are recorded by him, but he says something along the lines of, if you pay close attention to your dreams, you'll be able to predict the future. And he doesn't mean this in a literal sense, and I want to disclose this also in the intro to this video. I'm not saying that if you just pay attention to your dreams, you'll suddenly know your future, you suddenly know the future of the world. We have to look at this in a differentiated manner, and that's also why I want to make this video, because I think there's been a lot of sort of undifferentiated interpretation of Jung, which is sort of the general reason why the channel exists. But we'll get into this, and before we start, I want to thank you for supporting the channel, and if you do like the content, again, our mission is to look at Jung through a sort of clear analytical lens and try to understand it together from different perspectives with a more sort of rigorous interpretation, rather than simply saying, oh, Jung, spirituality, personality types, like other channels and places do, and sort of weave that into a journey of personal individuation and collective coming into being, let's say. But yeah, if you're new to the channel, consider to subscribe, and if you're a recurring user, then thank you for supporting me, continuing to support me. And as always, I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts in the comments section. So please leave a comment and, suggest anything that we should talk about, I should talk about, we should discuss, readings we should do, or ask any questions. I'll try to respond to everything immediately, almost immediately. But all right, let's get into this. I'm just noting stuff down here for the timestamps later. So what is the collective unconscious, and what is dual aspect monism, and what happens in dreams? So the first part of the video will focus on what is the collective unconscious, then second part, what is dual aspect monism, and then third part, how does that tie into dreams? And then finally, in the sort of conclusion wrap-up section, we'll get into how that sort of ties together and what that now means for the interpretation of dreams from the collective perspective, let's say. So the collective unconscious, according to Jung, is a layer of the psyche that is beneath the personal unconscious. So you can imagine this quite simply, If you have three layers to the world, then the layer is the individual in its conscious existence, so in its ego existence, you may say. So the way you experience yourself in everyday life, what you can recall consciously, think of yourself, I am this, I am that, sort of the story that you tell of yourself. The persona sits sort of at the tip of the ego, if you will. That is that which you display to the outside. The ego goes a bit deeper than that, but we'll talk about that in other videos. The ego, the way I think of the ego, is as a narrative, as a story, as a literal narration, something you utter literally to yourself, you rebuild over and over again. It's sort of this action. Oh, there's this pain in my elbow. Oh, right, that's because I literally just did it. What a synchronistic moment. I hit my elbow on my desk yesterday pretty hard. It's funny, that just happened in the moment, just to point it out. But these explanatory reflexes, let's say, are occurring on the level of the ego because they maintain a certain image, they maintain a certain narrative, a certain dominant narrative, if you will. So the ego functions on that level as the dominant complex within the psyche. So the ego is that which dominates the view that we have of ourselves. And on that level, the ego is not without influence of the unconscious. The unconscious constantly pulls on aspects of the ego, but this pull is unnoticed. And this is why we can speak of this differentiation, right? The ego is although it's stirred and determined by the unconscious, by the personal unconscious largely, there is still an element that is unconscious, right? There's still an element that you don't know about, that takes sort of work to reflect on, that takes work to get to know. And that is the area of the personal unconscious, you may say. So the area of the personal unconscious will maybe repress childhood memories, the typical Freudian sort of blah blah, if you will, repress childhood memories, repressed desires. It's a very complex structure that there's a lot to say about the personal unconscious and a lot of work to be done on that level. And the personal unconscious is not without influence on the intergenerational level, because the personal unconscious, at least according to some thinkers, and I think I follow this deliberation, if you think about Lacan, for example, the unconscious is structured largely, or comes into being, and the personal unconscious comes into being in the process of the initiation into language. So the splitting of the subject from this existence as oneness with the mother, and then it's initiated into language. There's the split there, and I don't want to go into this too deeply, but in this context, the subject is initiated not into language in general, but into language in general by virtue of the discourse of the parents, kind of thing. And by virtue of this discourse, there is an aspect of the let's say other entering into the psyche of the subject via the parent. So there is a generational element. So this is not to say, like, all I want to say with this is that we're not saying the personal unconscious is extremely personal. It's only about what psychoanalysis, I think, to a large extent calls into question these notions of who am I and who is the other in general. So, but again, this is a different video, it's a different topic. I shall write this down, like, maybe as a potential topic for a video. If you want to hear more about this, or hear me elaborate on this stuff, then let me know. I think it's quite interesting, and I think Jung has some stuff to say on this that may be interesting. But yeah, so that's the layer of the personal unconscious, and beneath that you have the layer of the collective unconscious, right? And the collective unconscious is essentially structured by, it's essentially a web, a structuring element, a structuring factor that is determined by archetypal modalities, let's say, or archetypal, I like to think of them as shelves. If you look at the shelves behind me, you have shelves within which certain books can exist, and within the books you have words written, and those words are not collective. They're what you experience in your life, how you fill the books. But the shelves are the strata, if you will, along which these books and then finally the words can be stratified. So for Jung, there's a good metaphor here that I like to give always. If you think about the psyche as the solar system, as the universe in a way, and you have the central dominant, let's say, where life happens, kind of thing, the central complex, that would be the ego, and that would maybe be the earth, right? So that's where your whole narration happens. But then at the core of this, you have the earth on the surface, and then you have something at the core of this, right? And at the core of the earth, so of the ego complex, is just like at the core of the other complexes, the other planets, there's something there, right? There's a core that's different from the shell. And this core is the archetypal core. It's different yet the same, it's the same kind of part of the same fabric. And for the ego, this something at the core is the self, right? So the ego, as in its sort of complex dominance, has as its objective counterpart, as its archetypal counterpart within its structure, within its structure as a psychic complex, it has the self, right? And it wraps around that. And that means if you trickle down in the ego, you go to the personal unconscious, and then you get to the self at some point. That doesn't mean the self in a way may be argued to be a description of the collective unconscious as a whole, but we can get to that at another point. But what is important is that you have many complexes revolving within this unconscious space, and parts of them may be conscious, parts of them may not be conscious, but at the core of each complex is sort of the archetype that determines the it determines the necessity of the presence of this topic within one's life, if you will. And this is almost functions like an instinct, right? It's like there will be a relationship like a mother relationship in someone's life, right? In a human's life. And this relationship will thus be structured by the archetype at the core, around which then the personal experience is built. So the images that then correspond or are in conversation with this archetypal image, but we don't know about it, right? And so the collective unconscious is sort of made up of these strings or strata, or however you want to call them, these archetypes, right? These it's sort of a topographical map. It determines the way you can build your life in a way, these archetypes. These are, at least on that level of analysis. And so that would be the collective unconscious is made up of that. You can think of it as groundwater as well. That's another good metaphor. You can think of it as groundwater that flows through, that's the fundament of all life. And then you have a lot of roots that reach down to it, and the roots, grow in different shapes, right? And then the plant that grows up from the root, plant is probably not the right word, but the plant that grows up from the root is then the expression of the individual ego, right? But so what's the relevance of this, and how does this relate to dreams? I guess that's, before we can get to that, I think it's important to note that, this groundwater is collective, so it's not limited to one person. If I say, one planet and then one ego, that's the limitation of the metaphor, right? It's more like we inhabit a microcosm within a macrocosm. So there's a macrocosmic element where these archetypes are accessed by everyone, but then they're accessed by everyone in an individual way. And I think here the metaphor of the roots and the groundwater is quite well, because you can think of groundwater to be present for everyone. It's the same groundwater. But now you have to take a leap and think that everyone has access to the exact same aspects of the groundwater, so to the whole, in theory. But now everyone has different roots, right? And those roots are structured in a different manner. Well, that means that everyone I think, according to Jung, and I'm not sure if he'd agree, but everyone's sort of born with a different resonance within the soul, let's say, right? Our souls, if you will, are structured with a different resonance body. And due to that, the archetypes that are the same for everyone, so the melody that's playing, which is the same, resonates differently within us, which then means that the individual, while the collective topography is the same, the expression of this collective topography on an individual level differs. And I think this is key to understand, because it on the one hand explains individuality and individual propensities, but on the other hand, it also explains the collective unity of everything, right, in the end. Now it gets even more complex than that. We're now at, 05. And okay, it gets more complex than that when we think about dual aspect monism, because the problem that Jung attempts to tackle is that this collective structure is not only the fundament of the psychic reality, but it's also the fundament of the physical reality. And now this is complex, right? And there are multiple attempts to interpret this, and in dual aspect monism is one, and there are others, and I don't want to get into a discussion now about which one's right, which one's wrong, or I don't want to judge it anyways. It's all of this are explanatory models that are probably all wrong, and none of them hits the truth, because you can't really express that truth. But the fundamental thing, I think, to take away here is that physical reality and psychic reality for Jung are not so different. And that may be because we're experiencing this physical reality. It may be that there's a metaphysical, that everything is an expression of the same. And this is how Jung formulates it, right? That everything is an expression of the same. And now some scholars say that everything is an expression of the same because we are humans, right? That would be an idealist perspective. And others then say, oh no, actually everything is the expression of the same. Full stop. Now, that doesn't really matter, but the point is that the idea is that not only are these archetypal complexes, so these strata, at the fundament of our psychic experience of the world, but they're also at the fundament of the expression of the physical reality. And this idea basically suggests that you have something like this. I don't know if you can see this, but you have at the fundament, you have, you know, this unus mundus, this one world, and then you have the expression of two different aspects, right? You have the expression of the psychic and the expression of the physical reality. And since these are connected within a common, they share a common ground, there's an overlap, right? And this brings us, wow, this was a quick section. Good, I'm proud of myself. I can talk quickly. Because there's this overlap, there is a possibility of tapping into the other while remaining in the other, well, the one while remaining in the other, right? And this is precisely what Jung proposes may be possible within dreams. And now, before we can thoroughly discuss dreams, we have to note that the collective unconscious doesn't have space space and time as we know it. And the reason for that is that time and space, but especially time, is a consequence of our sense organs for Jung, but I think this is also pretty valid or validated in neuroscience and so on, that time isn't something that, at least the way we experience it, isn't something that is necessarily imbued within physical reality as we think of it in common sense terms, you know, the kind of out there, you know. I think a lot out there, that's my opinion now, is structured in cycles, and Jung goes even further than that and says that because there's this space of the collective within which time doesn't exist, which is atemporal and encompasses everything, past, present, and future, there is technically a space in which time is sort of non-existent at all. So future, present, and past are one. And that is the foundation or the fundament of the possibility to see the future. Now, there's one caution, and then there are two important perspectives on this. One caution is that this is not possible, this is never possible. Okay, that's the one caution we have to take, because the ego is what we always experience through. Whenever you speak, whenever you think, whenever you say anything, you're in the space of the ego. There's no way you can have an experience, properly speaking, within the space of the ego. It doesn't work. It's simply impossible, because that is the definition of the ego. And by that definition, and I think this goes beyond the definition, but by that definition, you can't have an experience of the collective unconscious while being conscious. It simply doesn't work. And if you think about it, it doesn't make sense to work anyways. What you can do, however, is reflect on experiences that may have occurred and think about them under the gaze of the ego, and that means interpret them. And that's what we do with dreams, right? We have a dream, we interpret it. We may think, okay, well, what does this symbol mean? What does that mean? How does that relate to my own life? That would be more Freudian. More Jungian would be, okay, what does a symbol mean? You know, what archetype expresses here, and so on and so forth. But fundamentally speaking, this is all false, right? It's an interpretation. And it's very important to note that, you know, you can never know what a symbol means. You can know what it means to you in your interpretation, and you can tend to train yourself to see some kind of objective value, if you will, if that's even something desirable, and if that's even possible. I don't know yet. But so that's a very important caution. So there's no way to actually see any future and so on. This is all theorizing. But there are two attempts now that I want to propose to interpret this claim within this framework that we just discussed. So one attempt is, and this is the more daring one, and then I'll get to the more realistic one. The more daring one is that there's actually a space in which time is folded into, and there's sort of a deterministic element to life that actually implies non-causality and let's say no free will, which are aspects that I support. I'm all online to say, there's no free will, but for other reasons, which we can get to in other videos. If you want, please comment if you're interested in that. But it's a metaphysical claim ultimately. And I think, this is the second idea, what Jung was getting at, specifically in his comment there, is that the collective unconscious moves, and in its movements, it moves those who are part of it. And that means it moves the physical reality, and it moves the psychic reality. And it moves those who are present within the psychic reality in this very moment. So it moves the people in the world. And for that reason, and this is precisely what synchronicity implies, there is a way to recognize signs of certain movements within the gestures of the collective unconscious, let's say. So if you listen to the melody carefully and for a long time, and you observe it carefully, and you listen to your, what Jung would call an intuition, you would have the possibility to open interpretations of the ego that may make claims about occurrences within physical and psychic reality, or physical reality influenced by psychic reality of a lot of people, that then reflect actual occurrences in the future, because they reflect the sort of the correct prediction of the malady playing, if you will. And I hope this makes sense. And I know this is probably unsatisfying, but it prompts us to do something. It highlights to us, I think, that there's a very important value to dreams, and there's a very heavy responsibility in a way on the subject. Because if we'd all listen to the collective, we could see what is going on within ourselves and all others that are ourselves. Because we're all one, in a way. And this doesn't only include humans and their own will, in quotation marks, but it includes the occurrences within the physical realm as well. And we would be in the role of an observer, and this is the role that I think is most fitting to the subject. We're in the role of an observer, of a mediator. And a mediator is only the second instance. The first instance is an observer that then is enabled to mediate by the gift of being able to see. And I think this is quite interesting as a perspective, and it prompts us to think what we should do and what we could do as humans within this world. And I think I'll close the video on that note, because it's a beautiful note. Yeah. Thanks very much for tuning in and watching this long. I really appreciate it. And again, if you find this content interesting, please consider to subscribe if you haven't done so yet. And what I'm most interested in is your opinions, your comments, your thoughts, and your recommendations as well. What I should talk about, what we should think about together, what I should read, and your perspectives. Thank you very much.